Brett, Ivan, it's great to have you on the program. I got to tell you that I found your new book, "Scrolling Ourselves to Death," a collection of essays, really, but that you guys edited and contributed to, of course, to be very stimulating and nourishing in many ways. Brett, I'm going to start with you. You wrote the introductory essay to the book, and you also contributed one of the essays as well. Can Normally I would ask why this book and why now, but I think that question answers
Mhm.
itself because this is
Yeah.
a benchmark anniversary for Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death." But still, I can't resist posing at least some version of that question.
hmm
Why has this book, "Amusing Ourselves to Death," retained its relevance, and why did you guys think that it was a good fit for the Gospel Coalition, which publishes some books, but is very selective and kind of choosy about the books it publishes.
mm Yeah, I think Postman's book, it stands the test of time for a number of reasons. It's, I think, one of the best models out there of kind of the McLuhan method of looking at the medium and how a medium shapes discourse and the message. He's actually doing that. What McLuhan talked about in theory, Postman is doing in action in Amusing Ourselves to Death, looking at how, in that case, the medium of television was changing everything in culture, particularly how we talk about things, how we think. And so I think one of the reasons why we're attracted to that book as kind of a jumping off point for looking at today's technologies is just to kind of mimic his style of thinking carefully about technological forms and what they're doing to us in multifaceted ways. And so we wanted to kind of adopt that method for today's context, which, as we know, is there's continuity. There's some things that haven't changed in terms of this amusement culture of constant diversion. It's kind of taken to the extreme from what Postman was observing in the 80s. Now it's not just sitting around a TV with your eyes glued to kind of a TV screen. Now every one of us is walking everywhere, going everywhere with our own little personal kind of amusement device. But there's also new technologies that he didn't even anticipate that have changed things in different ways. And so we wanted to look carefully at that. And honestly, for me, I just have a passion to get Christians thinking in this mode. So part of the book is like specifically, giving tips and analyzing things. But I think the meta project of the book is just modeling a way of carefully thinking about culture and technology and how they interplay with one another, and particularly the impact on spirituality and the church and Christianity. You just don't see that modeled a lot in evangelical culture, and so we wanted to offer a resource that just gets people thinking more, I think, in that vein.
One of the things that I really like about this book is that uh, it wasn't a fawning appreciation of Postman's work.
Mhm.
Several times in the book, including Ivan in your epilogue to the book, you guys criticize some of the limitations of "Amusing Ourselves to Death" and Postman's thinking. Ivan, I'm going to read to you a couple of sentences that you wrote. Even Postman fell prey to this temptation in his otherwise stellar work. That temptation is to sort of want to turn the clock back to some previous golden age. His nostalgic enthusiasm for Enlightenment reason and the bygone typographic age sometimes limited his ability to speak prescriptively into the future, at least beyond a "let's mimic 18th century reading and oratory habits." Ivy, can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, there are some limitations to Postman's thinking, and the book was written, as Brett just said, before the internet, really, and before, certainly before social media and the smartphone. Um, Say more about the limitations of the book and where, what we can learn, but what we can't learn from "Amusing Ourselves to Death."
Yeah, so Neil Postman wrote another book called "Building a Bridge into the 18th Century." I recall sometime around 1999, And so I'm all about the 18th century. It is one of my favorite centuries as a church historian. I love studying the 18th century men in England, especially. And so I'm all about that in terms of what dominated that century. But at the same time, if we're thinking Christianly about technology and what it means to be faithful in our generation, there is never going to be a pristine golden age that we need to return to this certain era in order to be faithful. God has appointed Acts 17, the times and places that we inhabit. And so our call is not to romanticize the past. And if we just return to the 18th century or the 17th century or the second century, that somehow that is a silver bullet that solves all our problems. And so I think what Postman though got right is that he was a good critic of the culture. And so you need these sort of figures in different areas of life who are kind of the prophets in the wilderness who are calling out the issue. And so Postman was correctly diagnosing the problem. He was saying what was wrong about our day and age in the late 20th century going on into the 21st century. What he got wrong, though, was, or what he maybe didn't really think through prescriptively, was what to do about this problem. And that's what we're trying to do in this book is, since we are believers, we have God's word, we have God's revelation. That is the silver bullet. God is not silent, to quote Francis Schaeffer. He has spoken to us. And so we're trying to help Christians think through what to do about that. And that's where Postman just never lived up to that. And that's where Postman really helped us think through what to do about this problem.
Brett, one of the things that I've probably read Amusing Ourselves to Death, not every year, but probably read it a half a dozen times. I've taught the book, I've taught Technopoly, and other of Postman's works. One of the things that the first time I read the book, and then I keep coming back to it over and over again, that struck me about the book was that it is. It takes religion seriously. I mean, it devotes a whole chapter to, the televangelist Jimmy Swaggart and others. And Postman himself was Jewish. I'm not exactly, sometimes I refer to him as a secular Jew. I don't know how, how committed he was to his Jewish faith, but he mentions it often. And it certainly sort of permeates his worldview. Can you say a little bit about Postman's specific treatment of religion in Amusing Ourselves to Death?
Yeah. Yeah, Colin Hansen kind of gets at some of this in his chapter on preaching and kind of the history of the form of preaching and how the cultural context changed that. But I think what's so helpful with the way Postman treats it, with what he says about televangelism, and I think he talks about like just the second commandment and idolatry of um, you know, images of God and whatnot, and kind of the trivialization of Christianity through these different new media forms. And I think that's the word that I think is helpful, right? Like Christianity is a sacred, holy other thing. And yet in this constant mediation world, in this world of television and now social media and TikTok, when you bring kind of the holy down to just be another piece of content, whether it was he was talking about like TV church, like televangelists who would broadcast their preaching, their worship services, their experiences of God on television in between, the evening news and Wheel of Fortune. Like, what happens when something holy is brought down to the same level as, you know, TikTok dance videos and like AI cat videos, like, and then you have this like important thing where it's a preacher talking about some doctrine. Like, I think that's what he was worried about in the 80s with kind of the trivialization of something so important as religion is that much more true now. And Alan Noble talks about this in his book, Disruptive Witness, really well. I recommend that book. But I think that that's worrisome. And, to be honest, it's something that makes me occasionally have kind of a crisis of conscience as a content creator, as a Christian when I'm creating TGC. You know, we're creating content that people experience on their phones in between cat videos and sports scores and Netflix shows. Like, so in some ways we're adding to that dynamic as a Christian media organization. But it's worth thinking about, and we do think about it. Ivan and I and our editors think about this all the time. How can we be in this space of using these new media forums, but in a way that doesn't make that problem that Postman talked about worse, of
Yeah.
taking religion, which is categorically different than what you're consuming most of the time on your phone. But how can we still reach people where they are on these devices? So there's a lot there in that conversation, a lot to wrestle with. Shane Morris gets it, our friend, our mutual friend Shane Morris in his chapter is kind of, we wanted a chapter that looked at new media sort of optimistically, as maybe there are healthy ways that we can do this content creation as Christians, while at the same time being alert to the dangers of it and these big picture kind of problems that we're talking about.
Yeah. Ivan, I'm going to pivot towards you, and I'm doing this kind of blindly in ignorance here because Brett mentioned Colin Hansen's essay on how the medium shapes the message for preachers, which I found all of the essays to be excellent, but some of them resonated with me more than others. And I've got to confess to you that Colin's essay was one of those that particularly resonated with me. So, Ivan, I am wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you guys selected these essays and how you figured out who was going to be in the book. Who did you invite to be in the book? You mentioned Shane Morris, who I worked with for years at the Colson Center and continue to consider a good friend. I was really impressed by the overall quality. Again, some resonated more deeply than others. So can y'all talk a little bit, and maybe Ivan, we'll start with you, how y'all sort of divided and conquered that process and how you edited the essays to make sure that there was at least some coherence to the flow of the book?
Sure. Yeah, basically, simply put, this was an exercise to get who we wanted to hear from on this topic to be part of a book. So this was just a pretext for us to listen to the voices that we care, we respect, we are inclined to listen. These are the subject experts on this topic. And so given the 40th anniversary of Postman's book, we just looked at our digital Rolodex and said, who can we ask, who's available? And by God's grace, many of those responded and were quick to say, yes, count me in on a short notice. So yeah, I think the mixture of the book is the first half is more theoretical, and by the second half, it gets more application driven. So the first is honestly, and we confessed this in the very beginning, pessimistic. When you think about just social media companies, the monetization of our attention, when you think about the profit incentive, the dopamine rush, when you think about that in theory and you think about that in your own lives, it gets a little bit sobering when you think of how much of our lives are in some ways wasted away by the scrolling ourselves temptation. By the second half, we try to be, where Postman just did not live up to that prescription, we do try to prescribe more in the context of especially the local church. And so if you hang on for the ride for the first half and you finish the book, it'll end on, I think, a more hopeful, and that's the subtitle of the book, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. And so that juxtaposition of death is true, but we as Christians believe by God's grace, sovereignly reigning over the world, and especially in the context of local churches, that there's life to be offered in this kind of sea of digital media, that there's an evangelistic opportunity, an apologetic opportunity, and there's also a discipleship opportunity to help Christians grow in Christ, even in this kind of landscape that we live.
Yeah, I get that. And I get most days I believe that. But Brett, I want to come back to something you said just a few moments ago, where you say sometimes you have a crisis of conscience about that. And I've got to confess to you that I do as well. I mean, I'm now here at Ministry Watch, I am really almost exclusively digital. I mean, I still write books and I occasionally write for other people, magazines. But I mean, I live, in a digital world. I really also have some qualms of conscience about this process, whether it is indeed, whether Postman might not be right, that that a typographic culture. I mean, we would say that a culture that nurtures children rather than kills children is a better culture.
Right.
And so, in other words, as Christians, we are called upon to make these value judgments
Yes.
between cultural norms, one being better than the other, even. And I
Yeah.
do sometimes wonder, even though while I recognize the limitations of Postman's book, I can't quite convince myself that he's not right, that the
Yeah.
typographic culture really is superior to the digital culture, in
Yeah.
spite of the fact that the digital culture does offer great convenience in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, Warren, I'm probably with you. Like, I do think it's okay to, on the whole, think that we're in a worse spot today culturally in so many ways, technologically, morally, etc., than we were in previous generations. At the same time, I don't think it's helpful to only kind of lament that and have this nostalgia where we wish we could just turn back time and go back to the glory days. So I think you can have this posture of like sober realism, that every historical generation isn't equal, in its goodness, or its kind of common grace, elements. Some are worse than others, some are better than others. But for Christians, I think what's more helpful is to think about how can we be a redemptive presence, even in a worse situation than my childhood, right? Like I have three little kids, and I think that objectively in certain areas, they're going to have a harder time being formed in healthy ways spiritually than I did. They just are. And I can just bemoan that and lament that, which I do a fair bit. I'm kind of a curmudgeon in the Postman vein sometimes. But I also want to be part of a solution. I wrote my book, The Wisdom Pyramid, as a dad, wanting to provide a paradigm for my kids' generation to find health, by rethinking their intakes in this over-mediated world. We wrote Scrolling Ourselves to Death, or we edited this book for the same reason. We want the next generation of church leaders to have good thinking and good critical tools so that the church can be life, can help people reclaim life in a rather sick, spiritually sick digital age. And so, I think that there's times and places to cry out like prophets and to lament and to really call it what it is. There's a chapter in the book that I really do feel like has a prophetic edge. It's the one by Reed Mercer Schuchart, who is actually a grad student of Postman's at NYU, so he has a direct connection to Postman. Now he's a professor of communication at Wheaton. But if you read his chapter, to me it comes across as like this prophetic Jeremiad of a chapter. And we want that. We want the book to like feel jarring and to feel like it has power to shake people up, because we need to be shaken up in this culture right now. We need to wake up to the insidious power of this technology. But at the same time, there's reasons we can be hopeful. And we talk about a lot of the ways that the church has a real opportunity. And this is something at the Gospel Coalition. Obviously, we come back time and time again to the local church, and we wanted that to be a big part of this book. And I do think, like, in an age when more and more young people are going to be so spiritually lost, jaded by technology, afraid, anxious. Mental illness, as we know, is like surging with the next generation. The church has a real opportunity to be a haven, a refuge, an analog embodied space of safety where they can come get outside of their digital kind of black mirror bubbles of like narcissism, have their attention fixed on something bigger than themselves, and hopefully grow together, in embodied ways, which doesn't happen really anywhere else in culture. So we want to leave church leaders with sober realism and kind of a jarring sense of the problem, but also a galvanizing sense of here's what we can do now as the church to be part of the solution.
Ivan, I'd like to come back to you and ask you to explain something that I probably should have asked you about early in the book. There, a lot of times whenever I'm talking to people, especially students who to whom I'm recommending amusing ourselves to death, I will sometimes, if their eyes start glazing over, I will say, if you don't read anything else, just read the introduction, the first 2 pages, the introduction in which Neil Postman compares and contrasts Aldous Huxley's Brave New World with George Orwell's 1984. I'm going to ask you, Ivan, if you would, to make that explain what I mean by that, if I could, and because that idea comes up again and again in the various essays. I mean, this compare and contrast between Huxley and Orwell that Postman really makes, not even in the book itself, but in the introduction of the book. Talk a little bit more about that, Ivan, if you would.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, these 2 books, 1984 and Brave New World. And so Postman makes the case that everyone was concerned about 1984, Big Brother, hovering over all society, stifling dissent, when in actuality, the real threat was Brave New World, where everyone is seeking pleasure and taking these drugs to just basically live it up. And in that setting, the threat wouldn't be Big Brother. It would just, nobody would care. Everyone was seeking self-gratification, self-pleasure. And Postman argues that Huxley's portrayal, his prophetic vision, is what actually came to fruition. Now, of course, the curmudgeon quibbler in me would say, I think both realities are, in a sense, true. We do. I mean, I'm Cuban American. I come out of a world in which that censorious government overreach, communism is a reality. And when you look at different parts of the globe today, that is a reality that I think we should all be aware of and sobered by. But I do think the more fundamental reality where Postman really was right is that we are in a society. I mean, when you think about social media, when you think about your smartphones, that we do seek that dopamine hit where we just want to be entertained. We want to be amused. And I think Postman was right about that.
Yeah. Another idea that I want, maybe Brett, I don't know, Ivan, maybe you can chime in here as well. Another idea, another author that seems to be a spirit over y'all's book, just as Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan was a spirit over your book, is Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age. That book was referred to 4 or 5 times by, or more than 4 or 5 times, but probably by at least 4 or 5 different authors. And that causes me to think that, Postman wrote what he wrote when he wrote it, but others have come after him. And, you mentioned Alan Noble. I would mention, and many of your authors mentioned Charles Taylor. I mean, this really is an ongoing conversation. And would there be, Brett, folks that you would recommend, other than your book, of course, this book, would you recommend to people if they wanted to be a part of that conversation and to continue that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great authors writing about this right now. A lot of them get cited here and there in our book. Charles Taylor is a great one. As you were mentioning Charles Taylor, I was thinking about how much his theory of kind of secularization is tied to what he calls the nova effect, which is this kind of explosion of options in terms of, we live in this world where we have FOMO. There's options at every turn, spiritual quests that we could take. We could dabble in a little bit of Christianity, but also Eastern mysticism and other forms of spiritual quests. And I think that dovetails very closely with the smartphone way of looking at the world, where we are constantly aware of all sorts of paths we could take, all sorts of options, and it becomes harder and harder to commit and to kind of keep yourself to one system or one path. And I think there's huge implications for institutional religion in the technological age that we're in, because everyone is just so much more aware of all the other options. Like, it's not like generations ago where you were just born in the upper Midwest and you were, Lutheran or Dutch Reformed by virtue of where you were born and you never knew of any other option. Like, now you are born into a particular place with a particular religious tradition, but the internet makes everything more aware to you, and you kind of are conditioned from birth to kind of curate your own personal experience based on something you see on TikTok one day or a podcast you listen to. So I think Charles Taylor's a great companion. He doesn't talk a lot about technology, but I think the underlying philosophies of the last, century or so are very much tied in with what we're seeing with technology. One other recommendation that I'm a big proponent of is this guy named Hartmut Rosa. I don't know if you've read any of him, Warren, but his book, The Uncontrollability of the World, is hugely influential for me recently. And I know people like Samuel James have also been very influenced by him. He is a German Catholic philosopher, but writes really well about kind of the modernist impulse towards control and wanting to use technology to basically make ourselves God in our ability to bring everything, all contingencies under kind of neat control, and how wrong-headed that is, and how actually like the beauty in life, what he calls resonance, is uncontrollable. It's serendipitous. It's the weather. It's like it's the fact that you go outside and it may be sunny and it may be rainy, but you can't control that. And there's no amount of technology, apologies to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who thinks that, leftists control the weather and can create hurricanes. You can't, right? There are some things in life that are not within our power with technology to control. And I just think as Christians, we need to lean more and more into that. We need to lean more and more into our creaturely limits, our embodied limits in a virtual age that is, more and more with AI and transhumanism, trying to get people to uh, basically transcend all creaturely limits. And that's just a path to destruction. So, anyway, Hartmut Rosa is great. Charles Taylor's great. Ivan, I don't know if you have other um, suggestions for like other authors we
Yeah,
recommend.
it just depends on where you're coming from. If you're a parent, I think Andy Crouch's book from over a decade ago, The Tech Wise Family, if I recall correctly, would just be a helpful thing just to think through as parents. How does this translate into your lives in the home? Tony Reinke, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. Still sobering to think through that. One other philosopher in the spirit of that Rosa book that Brett mentioned is Byung-Chul Han, The Crisis of Narration. When you think about just our phones and technology, we just live, to borrow that big word, presentism. The here and now is all that matters, and so we've lost that narrative structure in our lives as a society, as a culture, where we are a small piece of that larger puzzle. And the reality is, in our TikTok generation, when you think through what is the effect of someone just for hours on end. I mean, I recently heard about a person on a flight and the woman next to him was literally scrolling on TikTok for 6 hours on that flight, just from beginning to end. And what does that do for society, for brains, for the way that you think about the world? It just displaces your thought about yourself, your surroundings, others. And so a number of implications. And again, I don't want to be too overly, dour about that, because I do think that that does present an evangelistic opportunity for the church to be the church in that kind of digital landscape, to be, as Brett said earlier, just an oasis, a digital haven from that reality.
Yeah. Guys, we got to sort of land this plane. Let me just stipulate for the record that we did not come close to covering all of the ideas that are in your excellent book. But that said, Ivan, I'll start with you since I started with Brett in the beginning. Is there an idea that I'm just not smart enough to ask you about, or maybe an idea that we did discuss here in the last half hour or so that you would want to stress or reiterate, as a sort of a final or a punctuation mark on the end of this conversation?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I would say, and I kind of end on this note with the epilogue, but there's a chance that a year from now, 5 years from now, this book that we did will appear outdated, because even since publishing this, we never really discussed AI, but that is a conversation that's all the rage now. And so let alone 40 years from now, that this book might in places appear quaint. So we wanted this book to be a very timely word. But one of the key things that I just want to underscore, Brett and I serve in churches. Brett has been an elder. I'm serving as an elder at my local church. We care about not necessarily what is changing this year or next year, but really what will not change, barring Christ's return, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whenever he comes. And that is a reality that we are sinners. We need Jesus. If we are redeemed by Jesus, we are now in the context of local churches sitting under the preached word. And so I think in these conversations, it's easy to fixate on the technology side, what's changing, and kind of be up to speed on that. But I think one thing to underscore is what will not change, and that is we need the Lord, and the Lord will be faithful to his people. He will hold us fast. And so a practical encouragement is kind of lean into the reality, the embodied reality of your local church. Sit under the preached word, fulfill all the one another's of scripture, love, forgive, uh, pray for one another. And I think that would just be the heartbeat for both Brett and me, is just to encourage Christians to not overlook the gathered worship of God's people. And that, in some ways, is the greatest antidote to what we're talking about here in terms of technology, social media.
Yeah, that's a good word. Brett?
Yeah, I guess I'll end kind of going to the beginning of my introduction in the book. I paint this picture of the new kind of humanoid posture of the digital age, which is the whole like head down, holding your phone, eyes glued to this device. It's ubiquitous. Everywhere you go, like every time I'm at a coffee shop or an airport. I was at an airport recently and I just looked around and like 90% of the people were just standing there with this posture of head down, looking at the phone. And what's important about that to think about is not just what people are doing on the phone, which is problematic, but it's what you're not doing. When you're in this posture of like constantly glued to your phone, looking down, you're not looking up. So there's this like worship that's not happening with your creator, and you're not looking around. You're not looking at the actual, tangible, embodied, image-bearing people who are in your immediate context, whether it's a stranger at a coffee shop you could be having a moment with, or even more sobering, it could be the family in your home where, sometimes I find myself convicted because I'm sitting on my couch glued to my phone and my kids are like 10 feet away, like, Daddy, Daddy, come like play catch with me in the backyard, right? Like we've all had moments like that where we realize what's at stake, what we're not doing, what we're missing out on when we are scrolling ourselves to death all the time, just glued to our device. That's where the real spiritual consequences come into play. We're not worshiping God as much, we're not spending time with Him, and we're not communing with our fellow humans. And that's the stuff of life. That's what we're created to do, right? To love God and to love our neighbors, not just to look at this narcissistic device that is algorithmically feeding you what it thinks you want, which is often very tempting enticements in unhealthy directions, to be frank. So put down your phone so you can look up and look around would be my final word.
And a good one it is. Brett, Ivan, thank you so much for being on the program today. I'm really grateful, and I'm grateful for your book as well. I found it to be nourishing, helpful in a lot of ways. And I was going to say entertaining, but maybe I shouldn't say that. But to me, it actually was entertaining. It was great to read these essays, and some of the folks I knew, but a lot of the folks I did not know. So to be introduced to what I consider to be new friends was a real blessing in this book. So thank you guys. Godspeed in your work, and yeah, let's talk again soon.
Thanks
for
Warren.
having us, Warren.